Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. With more and more insurgent groups from the northeast joining peace talks with the government of India, the region has been witnessing a drastic decline in insurgency in the last 5 to 6 years. Home Ministry data from 2019 shows that insurgency in the northeast region is continuously declining since 2014. According to the data, the region witnessed highest number of insurgency activities in 2014, but they started to register a declining trend thereafter. The insurgent groups carried out 824 attacks and killed 212 civilians in 2014. In response, the security forces gunned down 181. In 2015, the insurgents launched 574 attacks in which 149 extremists, 46 civilians and 46 security personnel were killed. The insurgent activities continued to diminish in 2016, in which 87 extremists were killed during 484 insurgent attacks. The figure of civilian and security casualties stood at 48 and 17 respectively. The insurgent attacks reduced to 308 in 2017, in which 57 insurgents, 37 civilians and 12 security personnel were killed. In 2018, the extremism violent incidents came down to 252, in which 34 insurgents, 23 civilians and 34 security personnel were killed. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the insurgency situation in the Northeast. Joining me on the program today are R.R. Rashmi, former Chief Secretary and Chairman, Finance Commission, Manipur; John S. Shilshi, former Director, National Security Council; and Avlok Langar, author and journalist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Mr. Rashmi, let me begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand the history and, all the baggage really that this problem has carried over the years.
Well, the Northeast is a very special region of our country. It is home to almost more than 100 tribes, but even if you count the large numbers, the large communities, there are more than 70 or 75. So it's a region which is populated by people who have very strong ethnicity. So they have very strong identities about their ethnic character, their ethnic origin. And this is something unique to this region, despite the fact that this region is largely egalitarian. It believes in equality, but there is a strong sense of identity in each of these different communities. So this is one reason why you see several attempts at emphasizing the distinctive identity, distinctive ethnic character of each of the groups in the region. And there are many states. I mean, there are, if you leave out Sikkim, the 7 states in the region alone, they comprise very large ethnic communities. Each one of them have specific political demand and then specific social and political orientation. So this is one reason why there are so many vociferous or divisive forces at play in this region, which has given rise to insurgency. Insurgency is essentially a rebellion against the political establishment. So whenever the ethnic communities feel that they are not fully being represented, there is a sense that they are being neglected or discriminated against. This gives rise to violent ways of handling things, and insurgency has been one of these primary. This is one of the primary reasons why it has fueled insurgency. But the second reason, which is also equally important, is how it has evolved as a political unit within India. Before independence, most of these states, if you exclude Assam, the plains of Assam and the plains of Manipur and Tripura, most of the hilly regions which were brought into the political mainstream of India under the British occupation, the British had deliberately excluded these areas and called them excluded area. Under 1935 Government of India Act, actually prior to that they were called backward tracts, but then they were later on redesignated as excluded areas. So this gave rise, and I think the British deliberately instigated these sentiments that they are a direct British colony, British crown colony, and not a part of any of the provinces in that region. For example, Naga Hills which were a part of, they were governed by the Assam, part of the Assam province, but later on they were excluded. It doesn't mean that the Assam governor had no, the Assam government had no jurisdiction in that area. It's only that it was directly administered by the chief commissioner or the governor of Assam. Similarly, similar arrangements existed in other parts of Northeast. But this gave rise to a sense that, they are more or less at an independent footing. And when the country became independent, there was a political group which nursed this ambition of, becoming independent. And the NNC was the primary force at that time in Nagaland. They gave this slogan for independence of Nagaland, and that became the mother of the insurgency in the entire Northeast. Later on, they adopted violent means to pursue their goals of independent nationhood.
Sure.
Legitimate or illegitimate, that's a different story. But I think this is one of the primary reasons it was instigated by the kind of policies which the British followed.
All right. So, Mr. Shilchi, let me bring you to the picture now. So, how have the authorities really addressed this particular problem over the last 5 or 6 years? What has been done? How have we ensured that the data has turned the other way? Because the Home Ministry data very clearly suggests that the number of attacks has come down, number of casualties too has come down over the last few years.
Well, thank you, Frank. First of all, in fact, you have mentioned also the MHA figure and things like that. And I think there's no reason to doubt that during the last few years, insurgency problem has, in fact, the incidents have come down drastically. Now, as far as what the authorities have done is so difficult to say, but I would ascribe 3 important reasons for this decline in the number of incidents in insurgency in the Northeast. Number 1 is our improved security relationship with Myanmar and Bangladesh, because this is a very important point. As you see, the way Manipur is located, the insurgents cannot survive and cannot function effectively as they would have liked to unless and until they use the Bangladesh or Myanmar territory, and also the exits through which they go about bringing in weapons and things like that. So during the last few years, we found there is a marked improvement in the security relationship between the government of India and these 2 governments, Bangladesh and Myanmar. This is one important factor. Second, of course, you have also mentioned that there are lots of insurgent groups who are engaged in talks. And it's a fact that when these insurgent groups are engaged in talks, actually the incidents will naturally decline. Now, for example, let me tell you one thing. The Naga talks was going on from 1997. But at the same time, the real hope for peace was seen from 2015 when the framework agreement was signed. Therefore, even with the existing what we call peace talk, which was already going on with the Nagas, also, it has seen a marked improvement from 2015 onwards after the framework agreement was signed. To the extent that you will not believe, many of the people within the NSA and IM today, we seem to have hit some kind of a roadblock. It's a different story altogether. But the fact of the matter is that we must accept the fact that from 2015, there has been a renewed hope. And that's the reason, one of the main reasons why many of the second rung and third rung leaders of the NSA and IM have started, in fact, giving out and giving their addresses, correct addresses and things like that. Because the hope of coming to a settlement was very prospective from their side as well. Now, the third factor is, of course, social. When I say social, I mean to say that, you see, there is a fatigue. There's a fatigue factor to everything. Even the insurgents are fatigued. Nowadays, you're not seeing so much of action like they used to do in the past. However, we must also admit the fact that there are extortions and other activities still going on. But having said that, fact of the matter is that violence have come down. Why? Because they have also recognized what is the thinking of the people. The people are also fatigued and fed up of all these activities. Therefore, the popularity graph of the insurgents are likely to further decline if they continue to involve in violent incidents indefinitely.
Right.
So these three factors, I think, I will attribute.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing out those factors really as to why the number of incidents have come down and what has really worked on the ground. Talking about what has worked on the ground, Avlok, I'd like to bring you into the picture. You spent several years of your life in the Northeast, written a beautiful book really about insurgency in the Northeast, interviewed several of these leaders as well over the years. What is different now, do you think, and how have things changed from the heights of insurgency to 2020 today?
So I would kind of like to build on what John was saying, that Mr. John, sorry, was saying, that in terms of there is conflict fatigue which is set in, and I think during my travels, what I started to realize was that how a state approaches conflict and how a movement approaches conflict is totally different. Because a state has a prolonged life. Successive governments will come. You can have different representatives, one after the other. You can have different soldiers posted on the front. So there is continuous energy that can come from a state's point of view. But for a movement to sustain, you need that individual to constantly be there. So I agree with what both the gentlemen are saying, but what I think is that we're witnessing the end of one cycle of this conflict, where you have one generation which is kind of completing a cycle, where they were young, they were at the forefront of this movement. They have all become substantially older, and over a period of time, while the state has been able to remain on one side and buy time, what has happened is that's led to a lot of divisions between individuals, human emotions playing out, which has led to lots of splintering between groups, and that has discredited a lot of these movements. And like Mr. John said, that's led to a situation where the local population might still, and in a lot of the cases, very much so, still feels for the emotions of that movement and identifies with that, but not necessarily identifies with the means of these movements and where they are today. So what you're seeing right now is a completion of one cycle, where what was the mode of putting across your demands is coming to an end. And of course, I totally agree. The military actions and the better relationships with both Bangladesh and with Myanmar have really helped, because a lot of these groups have their camps in Myanmar as well as in Bangladesh, and that space is just shrinking. And because that space is shrinking, these groups don't have that ability to keep fighting, generate revenue, things like that. So you have a situation where, as you mentioned, Frank, a lot of these groups have now come to the negotiating table. That's got to do with an inability to kind of impress their dominance, because they don't have that space. If you see a lot of the larger groups, though they are like an NSA and IM, which is definitely on the negotiating table and has been there since the 90s, they continue to hold sway, they continue to collect taxes, they continue to dominate the region and continue to play groups against one another. So they've been able to keep their power intact. But it's a smaller groups. Like now, I think the present governor has brought the other 7 groups into the conversation. But these are smaller, much smaller splinter groups who don't get a larger share of the revenue, who don't necessarily have the on-ground forces to kind of impose themselves. They want the negotiation. They want the negotiation to happen because for them at this stage of the cycle, that's a way to stay relevant. So I think that's what's really happened here, is that the Indian government over a period of time has been able to just buy time and wait out these movements. And you have these movements which are based heavily on individuals starting to degenerate. And it has caused a lot of emotional distress for people. It has been very traumatic. But I would shy away from saying that the issues which started these movements are resolved, or that the emotional connect with a lot of these movements is not there. That I don't think is true.
Okay, points taken. Let me take the points that you're making forward with Mr. Rashmi now. So, Mr. Rashmi, you've heard the other panelists as well. So, what are some of the aspects that need special attention going forward, do you think? What are some of the issues that continue to persist?
I agree that some of the sources of the problems have been handled well, and they have been resolved to a large extent. For example, the political isolation or political separatism has been largely, the issue has been largely resolved, except in some residual cases where I think we will be able to achieve the final results very soon. But three things come to my mind as far as the final resolution of the question of insurgency in the Northeast is concerned. One is that we must be able to establish very comprehensive economic and links and geographical connectivity through a transit arrangement through Bangladesh. This is one of the key reasons why after partition the sense of isolation in the Northeast increased, and this will not go away because this is a major stumbling block to the integration of the Northeast with the rest of the country, socially, politically and economically. We must find some way of enhancing the connectivity with that region in whichever imaginative way we can think of. We are negotiating with Bangladesh for a transit arrangement. I think we must conclude that as quickly as possible. So access to the region, access of the people to the rest of the country it's a both ways a process which must happen at both ends. The second issue is ultimately the Naga problem. You know, the insurgency in the Northeast began with the Nagas, and I think it will end with the Nagas. Mr. Shilsi was talking about a framework agreement. This framework agreement is very broad and at a very high. It is a very high level agreement, but it needs to be finally clinched, and there are ways of doing it. Some of the last issues which are still on the table need to be quickly resolved. But until we are able to finally resolve and settle the Naga issue, I think the rest of the region, although the insurgency has declined to a large extent, but the sense of discontent will not finally go away, and a political approach to these issues that things can be settled with the use of arms. This sense will finally not go away unless we have a problem. So maybe it's a matter of time, but I think we need to clinch that issue finally. And lastly, the external relations with our neighbors. Both of the panelists have emphasized our relations with Myanmar and Bangladesh. This really is the key to settling the insurgency in the Northeast and bringing peace and order in the region. The interference of the neighbors on the eastern borders of our country, it is well known. We know that the kind of role that they have played in fueling the insurgency, but countries like Bangladesh and Myanmar, whose role has not been, who's been just passive and offering shelter to these insurgents, if they are, we improve our relations with them, we mend our policies with them, I think we will win the war against insurgency to a large extent.
Okay. So, Mr. Shilchi, since we are here then, let's talk about what challenges remain, from a security and intelligence point of view. What is it that still lingers on, and how do we address that?
Well, see, from the security parlance, let me tell you one thing. The quiet or the calm down cannot be taken for granted until and unless we are able to nail, and then a political solution comes into being. We should not be complacent, saying that, that this period of a little bit of quietening should not be taken for granted. There's no room for complacency. Now, what's important here is that today, n number of groups are talking with the government of India, including the very important one, which other panelists also pointed out, the Nagas. Now, the thing is, even if these political solutions are brought with this group of people, group of insurgents who are talking with the government of India, right now, the biggest challenge is for the state government and the central governments to identify the splinter groups, the remnants of these groups, which are the factions of this various groups. You see, you cannot take it for granted that there's nothing to, and there won't be anything emerging again, because we must remember one thing: in any society which has tested the power of gun, it's very difficult to get away from there. So now, for example, let me give you one example. Recently, on the 30th of July, there was an ambush in Chandel district. After a long time, after a long gap of silence, or no incidents, we were able to see an incident taking place where 3 Assam Rifle Jawans were killed. Now, if you see the composition of those groups who were involved in that ambush, 3 different groups were involved. Now, these are the things that we need to study. For example, this group known as MNPF, that is the Manipur Naga People's Front. Today, the people in Manipur or the government may be thinking this is a very insignificant group. But fact of the matter is that when they are insignificant, they need to be engaged. They need to be spoken to. They need to be understood, and then it has to be rooted out. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult, because one understands that the Manipur Naga People's Front actually is a group of people who are actually dissatisfied with whatever is being done by the NSC and IM. So right now, the biggest challenge for the security and also the intelligence is that they must dwell down to the roots of this or small organizations, and they should not lower their guards thinking that insurgency has been done away with. Otherwise, we'll be making a very, very big mistake.
Absolutely. All right. So, Avlok, let's go back to a couple of points that you're making in your opening remarks and try and elaborate on that a little more. For instance, what impact have the deaths of the veteran leaders of these groups really had on the insurgency movement itself, and has it changed the internal dynamics? That is one. Do these groups still have the support of the people on the ground?
Okay, sure. But before that, I just wanna like say 2 things which are usually kind of unpopular. Number one, I think the tone in which like we're having a conversation right now is that we're talking about winning a war, and we're talking about we're looking at it from the same. I mean, again, this is how I used to approach my reporting there for quite some time. Because I came from a defense background, so that was how I was wired. And over a period of time, I kind of realized that the conflict is a physical manifestation of aspiration, of people's aspiration, and these people, for us and from our point of view, what we are saying are citizens of our country. So even the language that we use is very important, and we say that we need to win a war. That's a physical manifestation. We need to address aspirations. We need to have a real dialogue with people and understand where they're coming from, and not look at everything in terms of the military outcome. Right? I think that's really important in how we address these conflicts, because it's basically that it's an aspiration. I think Mr. Rashmi brought up how these movements started, but from independence. But a lot of these movements, their roots actually predate independence, and they had their own. The Nagas, their idea of a Naga state starts from their time in World War I and the Naga Club in the 1920s. And they declare themselves independent before India. So it's about aspiration, and that's kind of where we need to have this conversation if we really want to go forward. Because otherwise, like I was saying, we're going to see cycles. You will win the military outcome because of the sheer number and force of the Indian state. But like Mr. Shishi said, you're not addressing the real problem, and you will have a new group coming up. What I think, where everyone is talking about a way forward, I think the most important thing is to look at who the stakeholders are, because keeping these conflicts alive benefits a lot of people. It benefits a lot of people who hold power at a state level. So because in Nagaland, in Manipur, in parts of Meghalaya, in parts of Assam, elections, or even Arunachal, elections are linked to where you stand with these groups, and you make deals with these groups to barter power, and it just then it fuels this vicious cycle of corruption, both of a state legislator as well as of these underground groups who then collect tax. So we really need to look at it for what it is. It isn't black and white. They're huge shades of gray, and keeping these conflicts alive benefits a lot of people. So we need to, if we have to try and find a real solution, we need to identify who are the people causing these hurdles, right? So to come back to your question, Frank, I think 100% there is a huge impact of when your senior leadership kind of passes on, because it creates instability, it creates a vacuum of power, which hasn't really in it hasn't not the hierarchy is not always very clear, especially when over a period of time you've had so many splinter groups. So in that, there's so many, who's the real leader, who's actually representing the people, who should the Indian government engage with, who should the people believe in. So it creates these kinds of doubts, and that leads to a
Right.
situation where sort of people back off and don't take it seriously.
Sure. Okay. Time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward, starting first with you, Mr. Rashmi.
Well, the first, there are three things I think we need to do to be able to win the heart. It's not a military war, as Mr. Langar is saying. It's a battle of aspirations, and we need to win the hearts of people here. So one way, the first thing which we need to do is to settle the political questions, the question of political integration with the rest of the country, and giving them a sense of political empowerment, not isolation. The region is diverse in nature. It has a large number of diverse ethnic communities, but the political power which this region exercises at the center is very, very small compared to its geographical character and diversity. So this needs to be settled somehow in an imaginative way. The second question is that of the foreigners. The issue of foreigners is still alive, despite the fact that we are trying to underplay or think that it's there are different ways of looking at things. But this is a genuine and legitimate problem which must be resolved, and with strong policy orientation. And I think the government has initiated it in the right direction. The third is the economic and the social process.
Absolutely. Mr. Shilchi.
Well, I'll say just 3 points. Number one is that we should stop treating insurgency problem as a law and order problem. Number two, we should have structured, the present system of random deployment of forces, where we deploy forces who doesn't understand the social setting of the places, and then in the bargain they go and create some problem and they further alienate the people. This has to be stopped. The third point that I would like to make is that structured counter-insurgency policy, if at all counter-insurgency is an important factor to be taken by the government of India, that has to be evolved with a major role to be played by the local police. And last and of course final point that I want to make is we must ensure that the society actually identifies people who are benefiting from insurgency.
Right. And Avlok, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So I agree with both the other panelists, but what I also think is very important is when we talk about economic integration is also cultural integration. And what I mean by that is, it's how we tell history. It's how we tell stories. I studied history all through school, and there's something I write about in my book. I never learned about the battle in Kohima, the Battle of Tennis Court. Though I studied the world wars in class 8, class 10, class 12, even in college. But that's a huge part of India and our history. And we need to change the way we tell our stories to build a common narrative.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that dialogue and engaging with the groups has gone a long way in addressing the issue of insurgency in the Northeast. India's improved ties with Bangladesh and Myanmar has ensured that the insurgent groups have lost a base to operate from, basically lost their refuge. Most of the original leaders are either too old or dead. This has resulted in fatigue and disillusionment as well, as what the panelists are suggesting. Don't be complacent, identify and be wary of splinter groups. The situation can turn for the worse anytime. What we need is a long-term political solution and complete closure. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.